Lander, who's a professor of history at Stonehill College. And I also wanted to let people know, if you haven't noticed in the newsletter, we're showing the movie Thurgood, which has Lawrence Fishburne in like a one-man show about the Supreme Court justice. So take it away, Gary.
Well, thank you. And Thurgood Marshall, by the way, was one of the lead lawyers for the NAACP, and Thurgood Marshall never lost an appeal before the Supreme Court, and he also was the lead attorney for the NAACP in Brown v. the Board of Education in 1954. And also, if you win you some money on a quiz show, the attorney who appeared most often before the Supreme Court in the history of the court has been Daniel Webster. And the number is, I don't recall, I'd have to look it up. So if it means anything to you, if you've got $5, riding on a bet at the bar, your answer is Daniel Webster. So today,
Thank you.
well, you're welcome. You never know. I mean, I always like to be helpful, and I'm wearing my Easter purple as well. So it's the April is April, and let's go Red Sox. I know. I'm glad they got rained out yesterday. Catch your breath. Getting back. We have to renegotiate all of this. What I'd like to talk about this afternoon is to remind you, and I was reminded of this with Christine, that we have 3 sessions in the spring, and then we're going to take a break over the summer, and then we'll come back with 3 sessions in the fall, won't we? And possibly adding a 4th, depending on how this all plays out. I thought it was interesting today to be reminded that and we'll talk about this this morning, this afternoon rather, and that this is, and I don't want to lose my transmission with you here, that this is the Supremacy Clause, Article 6 of the Constitution. The Supreme Court is hearing arguments on Wednesday, dealing with the Arizona immigration law. And the Arizona legislature has pretty much taken it upon itself to implement the immigration laws for the United States here. Oh, that the state of Arizona has been challenged by the Solicitor General as to whether or not Arizona's immigration laws can be more severe, more punitive, and more restrictive than those of the federal government. And one of the decisions by John Marshall will be to establish Article 6 of the Constitution, the Supremacy Clause. So, that being said, let's begin, and let's begin logically here. Let's begin John Marshall, who we mentioned him just briefly 2 weeks ago last week, that John Marshall will create the modern Supreme Court. That is his gift to the country. John Adams always said, John Adams, who appointed John Marshall or nominated John Marshall, that John Adams, my greatest gift to the American people was John Marshall, which is quite a tribute from John Adams, because Abigail would have said, John would have said, it's me, not John Marshall. He's got the wrong John. So the question arose quickly as to who would interpret the language of the Constitution, and that question first surfaced in the John Adams administration, and John Adams in 1898, in order to stifle criticism from the party of Thomas Jefferson, from the first Republican Party, if you will, not the modern Republican Party, that in 1898, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison were looking to make a run at the presidency once again in 1800. And in order to discredit John Adams and the fact that he was a tyrant and did not deserve re-election and all of this, there's nothing new about the Supreme Court getting political, if you will, and Adams and using the court to quiet down, if you will, any kind of opposition. John Adams, and with the help of Abigail, had passed 2 measures. They were called the Alien and Sedition Acts. And without getting into the details of it, simply to say that both the Alien and Sedition Acts were a direct shot at the First Amendment, that the Alien Act the Sedition Act to quiet the press down and to jail editors and to shut down newspapers that were critical of the administration. And David McCullough, in his wonderful biography of John Adams, in fact, it's not a biography at all, it's a Valentine. It's a 1,000-page Valentine to John Adams, that McCullough brushes over, as best one can, the Sedition Act, which was an assault on the First Amendment. And the Alien Act simply was, and the word explains itself, the Alien Act was an attempt to slow down, if you will, to increase from 5 years to 14 years the number of years one had to be in the country before one could become a citizen. And that was done to slow down the growth of Jefferson's party for the upcoming election of 1800. Now, obviously, the Jeffersonians complained about both of these acts. Everybody complained about the Sedition Act, which shut down the press, fined editors, jailed editors. And the initial response to this as to how to deal with it was by both Jefferson and Madison, and they passed what were called, or they urged the Kentucky legislature and the Virginia legislature to pass the Virginia resolution and the Kentucky resolution. And these resolutions simply said this, and they urged other states to join them, that the state lawmakers, each state legislature, will determine the constitutionality of the laws of Congress. Now, if you think about that for half a minute, you're really going to have a problem here. If each state legislature determines the constitutionality of the measures of Congress. Jefferson and Madison argued this way. They said we cannot have the Congress ruling on its own constitutionality. That simply won't work. We can't have Congress saying, well, what we do is constitutional. Why? Well, because we did it. And we said it. We need to have an independent source of authority. And for Jefferson and Madison, both of whom supported states' rights, what better choice than to have each state determine the constitutionality of the acts of Congress. And they said this makes perfect sense. It's logical because the states had created the Constitution at Philadelphia. And we covered that in great detail last week. And remember that each state, one by nine, 9 was the magic number to ratify. So who better to determine the constitutionality of the acts of Congress than the states which had created the Constitution? And that's where it stood. And obviously this is messy, and this cannot stand. John Marshall is going to correct this shortly with his very important ruling in Marbury versus Madison. I'm not there yet. And in 1800, the election of 1800, John Adams, everything gets politicized here, and there's nothing new about that. In 1800, John Adams was not reelected. He lost the election to his former colleague, co-author of the Declaration, and good friend, and politics had broken that relationship, that he lost to Thomas Jefferson in Aaron Burr. And as far as John Adams was concerned, the election of Thomas Jefferson would be, and now is, a catastrophe, an absolute catastrophe. That he's a states' rights guy, that he will destroy the Constitution, and that all the good work that we Federalists have done since 1788 for the last 12 years will be undone by these Jeffersonians. It is a disaster. How best to protect the country against the Antichrist? And that's how they spoke of him. You know, that Thomas Jefferson is the Antichrist. That if you elect him, he will bring the guillotine from Paris. The guillotine will roll through the major cities of the United States, and there will be a long night, and these are his words, or words from the Federalist Press, a long night of blood and ashes and darkness. How best to protect the country? You know, let me give you this little anecdote as well, in terms of how politicized elections were. With the election of Thomas Jefferson, the president of Yale College, not Yale University yet, the president of Yale College asked the graduates on the day of on the day of graduation, he asked the graduates to stand, and so this will be in May, the election is in November of 1800, to stand and to pledge him that they would never vote for Thomas Jefferson. Now, can you imagine that today, a president of a major university in the run-up to the election asking the graduates to do that? I mean, it would be international news. And it happened because the fear was that the Jeffersonians would ruin the country. John Adams loses his election, and he's so upset, he's so distraught, that he does not even remain in Washington to greet the incoming president. Now that is such a bad precedent to set. It's sour grapes, isn't it? His son, John Quincy, will follow the very same precedent. When John Quincy is not reelected and loses to Andrew Jackson, that John Quincy Adams retreats back to Massachusetts rather than to remain in D.C. to welcome Andrew Jackson to the White House. Now, wouldn't that be a big story today? It would be huge if Barack Obama is defeated in 2012. It would be a huge story. And I'm not going to hang around to say, welcome, and here's the button you get for a sandwich. You know, and there's the men's room over there to the left. So John Adams is a sore loser, and John Adams wishes to protect the country from the Jeffersonians through the judiciary. And he does two things to do this. One is that he nominates his Secretary of State, John Marshall, to the vacancy in the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. John Jay, remember last week, John Jay had been the first appointee. He quit. There was no work. The second guy quit. The third guy is up. John Adams wants to reappoint John Jay as Supreme Court Chief Justice. He does not ask him. He simply just sends his name up to the Senate to be ratified. John Jay finds out about this, and he sends a quick text to John Adams, withdraw my name. I don't want any part of it. I didn't want the job the first time, and I don't want it the second time. So now John Adams is looking for a new Supreme Court Chief Justice. Bang, and he gets it with John Marshall, who is the Secretary of State, and he trusts John Marshall. Even though John Marshall is a Virginian and a relative of Thomas Jefferson, they're first cousins, they despise one another. That happens in many families, doesn't it? Nothing new about that. John Marshall is a Federalist. John Marshall is a nationalist. John Marshall believes in the power of the federal government. John Marshall sees the Constitution as both a legal document and a political document. And that's an important concept to hold because it is true right down to today, that the justices see it both at, I don't care what they say, or the phrase justice is blind, it's a legal document and a political document. You bring your personality and you bring your constitutional principles to the table on Monday when you talk about cases. John Marshall did, and he knew it. And that's why John Marshall kept all differences, as best as he could. And he kept differences out of the press. We want a unanimous opinion. Now, I don't want to get too sidetracked here. The tradition of the English courts had been, and this is the tradition that British America would have known, that in the English courts, in the English Supreme Court, the High Court, it's called seriatim. Each justice issues an individual opinion, seriatim. And then you all got to figure out where everybody is. And Marshall said we can't do that. We need to establish the authority of the court. We need a single opinion. And I will write the majority of them. But I do not want each justice issuing a separate opinion. We want one voice, one opinion. I will write, and he wrote over half of them, and then he would assign opinions to justices that he knew wrote in his spirit. That's John Marshall. And that, the exception to that, one important exception to that, and we'll talk about this come the fall, and that is the 2000 election in which the Rehnquist court elected George Bush by one vote. William Rehnquist did. It was his vote, 5-4. Each justice issued an individual opinion on that. And then it was up to the media and to whomever else was paying attention to figure out which way it went. So that being said, John Adams, looking down the bench. It's almost like he's the varsity coach looking down the bench. John Marshall, will you accept? I will. He's nominated. He's approved. Also, with the appointment, and this is where Marbury versus Madison kicks in. Also with the appointment, John Adams, looking to protect the country through the courts, appoints dozens of individuals to the courts and also to positions of magistrate and justice of the peace. And back then, a justice of the peace was a magistrate. He did more than simply marry people for $200. All right? There was more to the job than that. To protect the courts to protect the country through the courts. And literally, and I'm not exaggerating to make an effect here, as long as John Adams remained in the presidency and the clock is ticking down, signing these appointments. And these appointments became nicknamed the Midnight Judges, because as power was ebbing away from John Adams, he continued to sign these appointments. Most of them were delivered before the clock struck 12, and it's inauguration day, and I'm packing up and I'm leaving because I can't bear the thought of Thomas Jefferson being sworn in, and John Marshall, since you're the new Chief Justice and you're going to swear in Thomas Jefferson, would you mind showing him which button to push for a sandwich and where the men's room is? So it will be John Marshall, who doesn't get along with his first cousin Thomas Jefferson, who will do the introductions, if you will, and swear in the president as well. We tend to forget how personal it was in our early, it still is. It still is. And it makes it fascinating. And just talking about swearing in, John Roberts, thinking he's so cool, that he blew the inauguration. Right? I'm so cool in front of an international audience, I'm going to do it right off the top of my head. And remember that? And he flubbed it. I'm a risk taker, but I'm not going to flub the oath of office. Not with the whole world watching. Even I'm not foolish enough to do that. And to remember when he administered the oath, Barack Obama flinched, didn't he? Yeah. You saw him flinch, just a little hip movement. Wait a minute, that's not the oath of office. And they had to redo it the next morning, or on whatever, Tuesday morning or Wednesday morning, in the Oval Office to re-inaugurate or to re-swear in Barack Obama. I guess it pays to take care of details. The Midnight Judges, to protect the country against Thomas Jefferson. One more thought about that election in 1800. We tend to, and it's always good to be reminded of this, that election was also about an important precedent in American history. And the precedent is, it is the first peaceful transfer of power from one political party to another. There were some people urging John Adams to refuse to surrender the White House, to stay put, rather than to honor the election. And John Adams, to his credit, wanted no part of it. But when you think about it for a minute, that there was nothing that would have prevented John Adams from barricading himself in, and like some third world country, tanks in the streets with Jeeps and AK-47s. He stepped aside, even though he felt it was the ruination of the country. The guillotine would swing into Quincy for he and his children and Abigail. And the first peaceful transfer of power. That's an enormous precedent. And it will be John Marshall who will give the precedent to the courts, the Supreme Court, of determining what the Constitution means, and also whether or not state laws are consistent. State laws are consistent with the Constitution. A man by the name of John Marbury versus Madison. Madison is Jefferson's Secretary of State. A man by the name of John Marbury was appointed a justice of the peace in Virginia and Maryland rather. And He knew he had been. He knew that John Adams had signed off, had sealed it, but the appointment had never been delivered. The clock ticked down, power ebbed away from John Adams, and John Adams left the signed appointees on his desk to be delivered by Thomas Jefferson. Guess what? Never happened. And I can almost imagine, because Jefferson and Madison were close friends, and they had co-founded the Jeffersonian Party, the party of the Republican Party, that Madison telling Jefferson, almost, look over there. Oh, look, Haley's Common. And take these appointees and put them in the fireplace. They were destroyed because Jefferson and Madison knew exactly what John Adams was up to. And they were not surprised, and Jefferson at this point in his career loathed John Adams, and John Adams returned the favor, and so too did Abigail. Abigail no longer thought about Thomas Jefferson as being one of God's finest creatures. He now had become the Antichrist as well. Marbury keeps going to his mailbox looking for his appointment. It never shows up. He finally figures out, I've been had. You know, the appointment's been destroyed, and I've been lawfully appointed. And he hires an attorney, and his attorney demands what is called a writ of mandamus. And that simply is, mandamus means to hand it over. Hand over my job. To go, right, I want my job. And the writ of mandamus was to be issued by the Supreme Court, so thought Marbury, into the very hands of Madison. I want my job. Hand it over. I've been appointed lawfully. I know I've been. I was told. I had a query. I got vetted. The job is mine. And it makes its way to Marshall's Court on original jurisdiction. Article 3, and I'm not going to read it to you because it's clumsy, but you can read it on your own. Article 3 of the Constitution, Article 3, Section 2, carefully delineates which types of cases have original jurisdiction in the Supreme Court. In other words, it does not have to come up on appeals. And it's very narrowly drawn. It deals with ambassadors, problems the ambassadors get involved with, and so forth. So if you look at Article 3, Section 2, original jurisdiction. Now, what does that fit in? Hear me well. In 1789, when the Congress passed the Judiciary Act of 1789, in which they fleshed out the court system and determined that the Supreme Court would have 6 justices, they also added some powers to the Supreme Court. In other words, that they gave the Supreme Court original jurisdiction in this matter that Marbury was appealing on. That Marbury can appeal this on the basis of original jurisdiction, that I was not given my job as a magistrate, as a Chief Justice. And I'm appealing on the basis of the Congress, in its language, of the Judiciary Act of 1789, giving the court that power to take it as original jurisdiction. Went to John Marshall, and John Marshall's attorney showed up. Not John Marshall, Marbury's attorney showed up, and he made a strong and credible case. And Marshall told him that you're absolutely right. Your client, Marbury, deserves his job. You are absolutely correct. No question about it. In fact, I'll be happy to make that ruling if it gets to me on an appeal. You see, because what the Congress has done is that they have exceeded their authority. That the Congress has acted unconstitutionally in granting this court powers not found in the Constitution. If I had a blackboard, we could lay it out, and we could do all the arrows and dotted lines and so forth. Let me say it again. If you take the Constitution, and again, you know I always carry it. You know, don't leave home without it. Thank you. Thank you. You go to Article 3, Section 2. At Philadelphia, they laid out original jurisdiction. Boom, bada, boom, bada, boom, bada, boom. When the Congress, 2 years later when they convened, a year later when they convened in 1789, wrote the Judiciary Act, they added powers of original jurisdiction in which Marshall said, you can't do that because it violates the Constitution. And I am here in Marbury versus Madison in 1803, taking it upon the Supreme Court that we determine what the Constitution means, and when the Congress has exceeded its authority. Let me finish my thought, I'll lose myself, that there is no language in the Constitution at all that gives the Supreme Court the right of judicial review. That's what we're talking about. Marshall took it to empower the court and to grow the court as a co-equal branch of government, and to give it authority, and to give it, he hoped, never true, a bipartisan cast. We will determine, and you in Congress have acted unconstitutionally, and we say so, I say so, by judicial review. It was a unanimous decision, 6-0, written by John Marshall, because we need to speak with one voice, you see. Thomas Jefferson always thought, see, again, it's personal, that the Supreme Court, what Marshall was running here in the Supreme Court was really, and this was a dirty word in the 18th century, a caucus. In other words, a smoke-filled room where the Supreme Court justices met together and whether or not I mentioned this or not, I don't recall, that Marshall, not only did they write circuit, he was never able to get them to be relieved fully of the responsibility of writing circuit, and they're gone all the time. But he also made it a point, well, how can you insist, but asking the justices, let's all stay at the same hotel in Washington, D.C. We'll take our meals together, and we'll have, John Marshall was a devotee of Madeira, and that we will, during our meals, that we will, if you will, help along the conversation with one bottle of Madeira after another, and that along with discussing cases, that we will grow to know each other and like each other. And Marshall was a likable guy. Marshall was hail fellow, well met. He was one of, I think, 12 or 15 children. And Marshall was a sociable man. Marshall was a likable guy. And Marshall wanted the court to be a band of brothers. And for the longest time, that took place. And imagine that today. I mean, today on the court, you really have 9 individual law firms. I mean, these folks don't socialize in the sense that John Marshall would recognize it. We sleep together. We don't sleep together. We're staying in the same hotel. And we take our meals together. And we chat together. And we get to know each other. And I know when your birthday is. I know when your son is expecting your second grandchild. These were different days. And Marshall, judicial review, no, you cannot give us that authority. You have the job. Your attorney made an excellent case. You are deserving of that job. Absolutely, no question about it. But it can't start here. It has to come to me on an appeal. And I will welcome that appeal. And I will accept that appeal. He never got it. Marbury never got his job. He died. So there goes, that quashes the appeal, you see. But this is where it starts, judicial review. Yes, sir.
Article 3, Section 2 reads as follows. In all cases affecting ambassadors, other public ministers, and consuls. Now, isn't the Secretary of State a public minister?
Yes, he is. And that's why, and that's why they sued Madison for the job. You know, Marbury versus Madison.
So what it says, shall have original jurisdiction.
Madison has original jurisdiction in being sued. All right, in being sued. Marshall is saying you can give it to Marshall, but it has to come up on an appeal through Maryland, through an appeals court. That's what Marshall is arguing here. And Marshall, Marshall made it very clear, I say, if a law is repugnant to the Constitution. And the only thing that made it work, is that people accepted it. You can argue this language in many, many different ways, can't you? That's the beauty of it. That's the beauty of it, and that's why the Commerce Clause is under attack today. That and I'll come right back to this in about 5 minutes, that the Affordable Care Act is being challenged under the commerce powers of the Constitution. John Marshall talked about the commerce powers of the Constitution. And if John Marshall were Supreme Court Chief Justice today, he would say, the law is constitutional, as I read the Constitution. I'll come back to that in the court case of Gibbons versus Ogden in 1824. John Marshall would be on the side of the Affordable Care Act. But he's not on the court. He's dead. He died in 1835. We can't bring him back. But he would have been in support of this as being well within the purview in the language as he read the Commerce Clause affecting interstate trade between the states, between and among the states. So it depends. It always depends on who's reading the language. It's fascinating, isn't it? And that's why it's so hard to keep up on the court, because it's always, this language is always moving around. It's always, I don't want to use the word slippery, but I will. And because it can be slippery, sometimes 2 and 2 doesn't equal 4. Lyndon Johnson would say that, you know that. Lyndon Johnson is what I say it is. Lyndon Johnson always used to like to brag, and I always like to bring politics into this. Lyndon Johnson would always remind people when he interviewed for his first job as a teacher in Texas that he wanted the job. And he's like, I told the principal that I'll teach geography any way you want me to. If you want me to teach that the world is flat, I'll teach it flat. If you want it in a sphere, I'll teach it thusly. I want the job. So whatever language you want me to put out there, I'll put out there. So this is Marshall, 1803. Marbury versus Madison, the unanimity of the court. There's another huge decision. Now there are over 1,000 Marshall decisions. You could spend a lifetime and then another one before you ever were able to plumb all of those decisions. And I should mention this, that over time, Marshall's band of brothers began to dissolve because men got off the court. They died. Appointees were made by a Jefferson, or appointees were made by a Madison who followed Jefferson, or a Monroe of Virginia who followed Madison. And these men were not as willing to be, maybe the word cuckold, or to be, if you will, caught up in the personality of John Marshall. And John Marshall found that over time, his ability to control the thinking of the court dissolved as folks no longer wanted to live in the same boarding house, but live elsewhere, and to bring in their staffs and to think in individual ways. So it's so much about craftsmanship. Speaking of being political, that in my view, the Obama administration, if they lose this, if they lose the Affordable Care Act, they can play it to their advantage. They can simply go to the country and say, give me the court I need for the good of the people. Give me the court I need one more vote. So I think it's going to go down 5-4, or large parts of it will go down 5-4. Give me one more vote. This election is about the future. This election is about your health care. This election is about having one more vote on the court. And if he loses, he could simply say, this election is about redrafting this in ways that are consistent with Medicare and Medicaid, and help me do this. Give me a Congress that we can draft a law that will pass muster before the court. So, you can play this as a win-win. But we're in 1819. We're not in 2012. In 2012, in 1819, McCulloch versus Maryland is another important court case. And this deals with reading the Constitution. This deals with what is the phrase in Article 1. If you look at Article 1 of the Constitution, at the very close of Article 1, grab my glasses. I can't leave home without these either. The captain of the Titanic was not wearing his glasses. He wasn't. Nor did he have his binoculars. Nor did his lookouts have them. That was standard equipment after the Titanic. Here we go. If we look at Article 1, here we go. Article 1, Section 8. Now, Article 1 deals with the legislature, and if you look at Section 8, the closing words in Section 8. In Section 8, Congress, in Section 8 of Philadelphia, those who wrote the Constitution laid out all the specific powers of the Congress. And they're called, well, they're called that. They're simply called the specific powers. Back then, the word was enumerated. Listed, we don't use that word anymore. However, in their wisdom, in their infinite wisdom, talk about language of anticipation. At the close of listing all the expressed powers, all the enumerated powers, in their wisdom, someone placed this phrase, that Congress has the right to make all laws which shall be, and underline this, necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or officer thereof. Officer thereof, in this case, would be, well, initially would have been Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. It's called the Necessary and Proper Clause. It is a sweet phrase of anticipation. When the Bank of the United States was first formed, and I'll be brief, the Bank of the United States, Alexander Hamilton said we need three things up front. We need a tariff to protect our infant industries against foreign competition, right? We need a tariff. We need a constitution that supports manufacturing, and we also need a national bank. Just like Great Britain has a national bank, we need a national bank to do business, to be a real country, a powerful country, and not simply rely on state banks. Now, state banks are the hobby horse of those who support states' rights. We still fight that battle. It's the 10th Amendment. That's what's before the court as well. What Hamilton had been able to do was to convince Washington that the necessary and proper clause means it is necessary and proper for us to have a national bank. Even though in the Constitution there is no language that says we can have a national bank. There's no language that allows for that. It's all state banks. Hamilton to Washington, and if you will, on to the Federalist Congress. We cannot run a country without a national bank. I cannot do the nation's business through the state banks of New York, Philadelphia, and Boston. I can't keep all those checkbooks balanced. I can't keep any checkbook balanced. I haven't balanced a checkbook in 25 years. I don't go looking for a nickel or a dime. Forget about it. I need a national bank with my name on a checkbook that reads, I don't know, Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of the Treasury, whatever his address is, 1604 Pennsylvania Avenue, whatever it is. I need a check. I need that. And in the early going of the country, as you well know, we just talked about it, what does the Constitution mean? What do the words really mean? You know, what does I do mean? Does it mean I do, I don't? Does it mean I do, maybe? All right, what does the language mean? And Hamilton to Washington, that we need a bank, and necessary and proper means we need a bank. That if we are going to, and Hamilton would walk you through it today, that if we have, and let me just tick off a couple of things for you, if Congress, as an enumerated power, has the right to lay and collect taxes, for example, pay the debt, provide for the common defense, to borrow money, to regulate commerce, to coin money, to regulate its value, and so forth, to do all of those things, we need a national bank, rather than relying on state banks. And Washington bought into it. Jefferson did not. He's a states' rights guy, but it didn't matter. Washington carried the day, Hamilton carried Congress, a Bank of the United States. Fine, perfect. Charter for 20 years. And then during the War of 1812, it disappears. Its charter expires in the middle of a war. Financing the war is messy at best, sloppy at worst. And at the end of the war, the question now becomes, we need a new national bank. John Marshall's on the court. And a measure for a new national bank is passed right after the War of 1812 in 1816. And the new national bank sets up a branch around the country. Well, it's not around the country yet, we don't have that many states. But they set up a branch in Maryland. And the director of the branch of the Bank of the United States in Maryland is a man by the name of McCulloch. Now, Maryland has its own state banking system. They do not want competition from the feds. Not on our watch. We don't want your competition. We want to keep all the business within the state banks of Maryland. So what the Maryland legislature does is they tax and tax and tax again the national bank in Maryland to drive it out of business, to make it economically unprofitable. McCulloch refuses to pay the tax and refuses to succumb to the taxing power of Maryland to try to drive the national bank out of business. And he says, no, no, no. And it goes to the state courts in Maryland, and what a surprise. The state of Maryland upholds the state of Maryland in supporting state banks in the state of Maryland and to crush this monster, the Bank of the United States. McCulloch appeals this, and it goes to the Supreme Court on appeal, unlike Marbury versus Madison coming out of Maryland. Marshall is looking for cases, once again, to establish his authority. And the attorneys for the government make their case, the attorneys for the state of Maryland make their case, and it's Marshall in a unanimous decision in 1819 that the language implied powers is constitutional, that the language which provides for necessary and proper is sufficient language to support the constitutionality of the Bank of the United States. That it is constitutional because this bank is governed by, if you will, comes into existence through implied powers to help this government carry out the express powers of coining money, regulate its value, to punish counterfeiters, to collect taxes, to pay debt, to be able to do the nation's business. It is perfectly consistent with the language of the Constitution. Now that's, I think for you and me today, that makes eminent sense. But back then, it was always a battle over every word, every paragraph, and it is Marshall, who, by the way, by the mid-1820s, his health is beginning to fail. And the new members on the court no longer defer to the great John Marshall, so that band of brothers is beginning to dissipate. And not only that, and if you're not healthy, you can't do your job. And not only physical health, but emotional health. John Marshall's wife of so many years passed away. John Marshall suffered from growing stomach problems. He had gallbladder surgery without anesthesia because he wasn't able to tolerate what was available. So, that'll do you in. That's kind of nasty stuff. Yeah, I know, imagine that. And so Marshall not only is losing his band of brothers, but his wife has passed and his health is failing. But that being said, we need to also talk about the Supremacy Clause. And this is a court case a few years later in 1824, and it's Gibbons versus Ogden. And Gibbons versus Ogden is all about making money. It's all about controlling traffic, river traffic, across the Hudson, New York to New Jersey and wherever else you want to go in 1824. It's hauling people. More than that, it's hauling stuff. It's commerce. And the state of New York had given Ogden a monopoly on all travel across all, if you will, not steamboat yet, but all travel across the Hudson River. And he had a monopoly on this, and he had locked up all this commerce. One guy. And the state of New York gave him that authority. And a man that he'd worked with a while, a man by the name of Gibbons, Gibbons versus Ogden, that Gibbons and Ogden had a falling out, and in the process of that falling out, that Robert Fulton had pulled a rabbit out of a hat, and the rabbit looked like a steamship. All right, so it's steam power to be able to get across the Hudson River a lot quicker, to generate more traffic, and to be a more reliable transporter of goods than simply relying on the air and the wind and the currents along the Hudson River. So Gibbons set up he went into competition against Ogden. Ogden took him to court. I have a monopoly from the state of New York. You can't break that. The state of New York determines what commerce is across the Hudson River. John Marshall. Boy, you know, he must have always had his nose in the air, don't you think? You know, looking, you know, what case has the right fragrance, you know, for me to build the Constitution? He saw he saw the nation. He saw his role as building a national government, that this is a political document as well as a legal document. And it comes to him on appeal through New York, or through the appeals process, and Marshall rules in Gibbons versus Ogden. It's unanimous. What a surprise. He wrote it, is that the Article 6 in the Constitution clearly lays out that the federal government will determine what is commerce. And commerce is regulated by the federal government, because in this instance, it's not simply within a state, intra-state, which the states can regulate. It's interstate. And the reason I'm mentioning intrastate is I'm setting the hook for you come the fall, that when the Supreme Court is going to strike down several provisions of the New Deal, and one of the provisions will be one of the ways in which the court rules against the New Deal is they take a view of intrastate commerce that technically is correct, but would violate, if you will, Marshall's view of commerce. And we know, don't we, that courts overrule each other, don't they? They do so reluctantly. Precedent is precedent. And appeals judges need to know what the law is. When John Roberts was interviewed for his job by the Senate, one of his concerns, well, there were two concerns. One is he wanted fewer 5-4 decisions because they're too narrow. That's all we get today. You know, he wanted a more authoritative voice for the court, and in so doing, to give direction to the lower courts, so they know what the Supreme Court has said, specifically 7-2, 8-1, rather than narrowly defined decisions, which might be rewritten or rethought with the change of one justice. I mean, you go 5-4, can work 4-5 with one death or one resignation, or one impeachment for that matter. Marshall, Section 6 of the Constitution. It has 7 sections. And again, let's see here, it's right in here. If this is Article 6, Article 6, and it's called the Supremacy Clause, that federal law trumps state law. That's what the Arizona case is all about. Federal law trumps state law unless there are compelling interests to allow the state law to stand. Because there is a balance, isn't there, between state law and federal law. That's the 10th Amendment. And Marshall respected that. But this is trade. This is commerce. This is how the country prospers and grows. And here's the language. This Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made, or which shall be made, under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land. There you go. Under the authority of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land. And the judges in every state shall be bound thereby, anything in the Constitution or laws of any state, to the contrary, notwithstanding. The Supremacy Clause. We trump, this Congress, my Congress, trumps state law. Unless there are compelling state interests, which remain, in other words, intrastate. This is interstate. Commerce going from New York to New Jersey. And competition is good. Competition is, it's good for pricing, it's good for business. We support a broad definition of the Commerce Clause, and we reject the finding of the New York Supreme Court. It goes on all the time. Yes, ma'am?
Where is the words unless there are compelling reasons?
That's Marshall. It's not here.
It's not-
That's Marshall. And whatever that means is what Marshall says it means, right?
Right.
That's, you know, it's like the teacher. Whatever I say goes, right? And that's Marshall, unless there are compelling interests. And he would say to you, when I think there are compelling interests. The guy had chutzpah. I mean, the guy really did, and he had the personality to push it off. Pulled off a likable guy.
Well, isn't there an inconsistency in...
Why not?
In the fact that he says, I'm not going to hear the case unless it comes up to me in appeal, because that's what the Congress said. And then on the other hand, he said, Congress doesn't say that, but I have the right to make the ruling.
Absolutely, it is inconsistent. And Emerson and Ralph Waldo Emerson, who grew up not too far from here, would say that consistency is the hobgoblin of a small mind. In other words, don't get caught up in being consistent all the time. John Marshall will take I am going to get into this. John Marshall will take, when it suits his purpose, a very literal view of the Constitution. Here with the Commerce Clause, it's broad. With the McCullough versus Maryland, it's a broad interpretation. With Judiciary Act, it's a broad interpretation. However, when it came to nailing and sending a message to Thomas Jefferson, because Thomas Jefferson wanted Aaron Burr tried for treason and hanged, and he was involved in something treasonous. And when it got to the Supreme Court, John Marshall allowed Aaron Burr to walk because according to the Constitution, as he read it, literally because it was in his interest to do so, because I want to nail my first cousin, Thomas Jefferson, who I despise, and is going after Aaron Burr. It doesn't matter that Aaron Burr might have been committing treason. I don't like President Thomas Jefferson. And Marshall, kicking out, refusing to charge Burr with treason, because in the Constitution, and if you read the treason charge, that Marshall said, you do not have two witnesses to the very same act of treason. I need two witnesses. You don't have two. The one you have is pretty slippery, and it looks like he was involved with this as well, until it looked like he was going to get in trouble, so he's willing to talk to save his hide. You don't have two witnesses. Read the Constitution. You got one. You don't even have one. You got one who lies. Gone. So, yeah, it's inconsistent, and that's the beauty of it. And that depends on personality, doesn't it? And I would very much, I'd like to be a fly on the wall in several situations, to use a cliche. But I think it would be interesting to sit down Monday morning when the court, behind closed doors, they talk about what's coming up this week. They talk about how they're thinking about an opinion, and those are not recorded. The door is closed, and if you want entry, you need to knock. Or maybe you're bringing in your Dunkin' Donuts and your Dunkin' Donut coffee, and you have to love tradition. The junior member of the court has to answer the door. And that's Elena Cable, all right? So it's like, maybe it's like having a table in the restaurant next to the men's room, all right? Because that's the only table that's available. So she has to open the door. That's why she made that crack when to Roberts, and who else? It was Roberts interrupted her, and I think Stevens whatever, it was Roberts that interrupted her, talking about when they were arguing the Affordable Care Act, and she was asking a question, and it was either Roberts or it may have been Stevens, that somebody just interrupted her, right in the middle of the question. She had a follow-up, and she never got to the follow-up. He just simply interrupted her, and she said, well, I guess that happens when you're the junior member. And they all had a little laugh over this, but that's what happens. Yeah, I'm senior to you. I can interrupt you. Right? There's no follow-up. I have a question to ask before I forget it. And that's what Stephen said. Well, before I forget the question, excuse me, I'm asking this question. And then she forgot the follow-up. Because he went back to her to be a good guy about it. She said, I forgot the question. Now, I like that stuff. It makes it human, doesn't it?
Wasn't that Anthony Kennedy?
Was Aaron Burr vice president at the time of this trial?
No. Hang on. No, he was not.
Oh.
Aaron Burr was vice president when he gunned down Alexander Hamilton and then fled. And there was an indictment from New York.
So impeachment didn't apply?
No, not at all. I'll tell you, Thomas Jefferson did not want him on the ticket again. As a sitting vice president shooting down Secretary of Treasury Alexander Hamilton. I mean, imagine you're watching television and suddenly it comes up that Timothy Geithner is wanted dead or alive. And that Timothy Geithner has been shot down, and by whom? I don't know. By somebody working for Barack Obama, and do not approach this person. Call your local police department. This was much later on, and what he did after this, he being Aaron Burr, is that he took off. He left the country for a while, and to make sure that there were no efforts to get him additionally. So it's Gibbons versus Ogden, Fletcher versus Peck, and also another important court case in the 20s, which sanctified private contracts. In other words, that if a state makes this is inconsistent with Gibbons versus Ogden, that a state cannot simply revisit a private contract and rewrite it to their benefit. That a deal is a deal is a deal. And contracts, private property, are sacrosanct. This is a nation of laws. This is a nation of capitalism and private property. Marshall, protecting contracts. Marshall, expanding the concept of commerce. Marshall, judicial review. We say what the Constitution means. Marshall, talking about that we need to do what is necessary and proper. And also, he didn't cite this, but he could have, because Alexander Hamilton always went back to this language as well, in the preamble, in order to form a more perfect union. And that you can take that language and stretch it like gum, can't you? A more perfect union is what I might think, what you might think, and you might object to it. So, but Hamilton invoked both of that, a more perfect union and necessary and proper, going to the need for a national bank system. And it's good stuff. In 1830, it's great stuff. In 1835, Marshall dies, and the next Supreme Court, major Supreme Court Chief Justice, so what I'll do the next time we meet, and we'll just brush over him, because we need to get to the courts at the turn of the century, the high tide of the Industrial Revolution, and we need to get to Holmes and Brandeis, and we need to get to Woodrow Wilson. We need to get to that part of the court, because that provides the language for the New Deal. And then we'll get to the New Deal, and then we're off to the 50s and 60s and to the Warren Court and whatever else happens on the front page. So that's our storyline for this afternoon. And it was one other thing I wanted to mention about Aaron Burr. Oh, Aaron Burr was sired 2 children out of wedlock in his 70s. But that's not but I'm going to trump that. All right? I'm going to trump that for Aaron Burr. Aaron Burr was divorced for adultery at the age of 82. If you know that much about Aaron Burr. No wonder Thomas Jefferson said, I don't want him on the ticket in 1804. Who vetted this guy? So I will see you next week. In 2 weeks, I'll see you in 2 weeks, and we'll do a forced march right to 1900 and the progressives.
You're not going to do much with the pre-Civil War court and
I'll
and all of those?
We don't have time. The only thing I'm going to mention with Tawney is that Tawney received the nomination by Jackson to Chief Justice. This is a 15-week course. We're trying to do it in 6 hours. We're trying to do 6 hours in 40, we're trying to do 45 hours in 6. Roger B. Tawney was appointed Marshall's successor because Roger B. Tawney did Jackson's dirty work, his political dirty work. And that was to withdraw funds from the National Bank, to force the National Bank into bankruptcy, to collapse it, and to put all the money back in state banks, because Andrew Jackson was a state bank guy, a hard money guy, and Andrew Jackson had a score to settle against Henry Clay, and this is all the politics of it. And that's why Tawney got to the Supreme Court, because Tawney, as the third choice at Treasury, the first guy that Jackson wanted to go to the Treasury said, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to pull all the money out and force the National Bank into bankruptcy. It'll cause a depression. And Jackson said, well, I don't want you for the job. The next guy said the same thing. It's bad economics. I don't want you. Roger B. Tawney said, I'll do whatever you want. I want the job. I'm going to be a Secretary of the Treasury. So Tawney did it. The money came out. The bank failed. The country went into a recession. Martin Van Buren was president. And when it happens on your watch, you get blamed. So the press conveniently referred to Martin Van Buren as Martin Van Ruin. It was Jackson who pulled all the money out. And Jackson says, Tawney, you're my kind of guy. I want you on the court. And it's Tawney who will support slavery. Andrew Jackson was a slave owner. And that Dred Scott decision will wind up on his desk in 1857 on the cusp of the Civil War. And Tawney did not even have to rule on it. He could have simply said the ruling of the Missouri State Supreme Court stands. But he said, you know what? I want to call that case in because I've got something to say about slavery beyond what the Supreme Court of Missouri said. And that helped to bring a civil war. Lincoln saying this decision has all the moral authority of a decision made in a barroom. How about that? So for Barack Obama to get 2 weeks ago a little hot about the way his Solicitor General was handled and the questions from the bench, for him to get a little hot, there's nothing new about that. For Franklin Roosevelt to get a little hot, as we said last week, and talk about the Supreme Court being filled up with 9 old men who have a horse and buggy definition of the Constitution. Presidents get hot over things. And Barack Obama, if he thought quickly enough, would have said, that is a horse and buggy definition of the Commerce Clause. We've got Medicare, we've got Medicaid, and health care is interstate. It goes across the country. See you later. I can work it out.